Well, last time we covered the events connected to Jesus' introduction to the New Testament Passover and concluded with him waking Peter, James, and John after he had finished his third round of prayer to the Father in heaven. That brings us now to chapter 22, verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, or Moffat says, there came a mob. And he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. Judas and the mob, which included some Roman soldiers, came to arrest Jesus, acting on the authority of the Sanhedrin. John's account records that Jesus, at that point when they came up, he stepped forward and asked them whom it was that they were seeking. And when they responded, he told them he said, I am. He used that name that Moses was told who the God was who came to Moses. I am. And at that point, when they heard that, according to John's account, they all fell backward. Now, that's John. John's the only one that mentions it, but we have details from each one of the writers of the gospel accounts. Verse 48, but Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Now, Jesus was fully aware of Judas's commitment to the chief priest, which was to identify Jesus with a kiss. That's back in Matthew chapter 26. In addition to the darkness in the garden, which was, again, the garden was bathed in the light of the full moon. So it's not complete, utter darkness, but you know how it is with a full moon. You can see and you can make out people. You can't necessarily see the features. And so it was fairly dark. And again, very few of the soldiers would have seen and remembered Jesus' face, which made such a personal action, coming up and giving a kiss on each cheek, a necessity in order to make sure you're getting the right guy. According to the accounts of Matthew and Mark, Judas immediately after Jesus asking that question came up and kissed him. At that point, Matthew records Jesus giving a command while looking directly at Judas. Matthew tells us that Jesus said, friend, do what you are here to do. And he said friend. He initiates it with the term friend. Do what you're here to do. The command was not to Judas. The command was to Satan, the devil, and referred to the first messianic prophecy in the Holy Scriptures, the prophecy that revealed that the serpent there in the garden, who was Satan the devil, would be responsible for putting an end to the Messiah's walking in the flesh, which Satan was about to do by orchestrating the betrayal and death of Jesus Christ. That prophecy, which we need to keep in mind back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, make sure we look at this carefully. Genesis 3:15. This is where God, and at this time it was God the Word, the one who became Jesus Christ, was speaking and made this statement. I, he says, will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, and between your seed, which we know when we go to John chapter 8, Jesus said that you are of your father the devil when he was talking to the religious leaders. You are of your father. That means you're the seed of your father, the devil. And so I will put enmity between your seed and her seed, singular, which was a reference to the virgin birth. He shall bruise your head. That is, the seed of the woman will bruise your head. And you shall bruise his heel. You will prevent him from continuing to walk, and basically in the flesh. Satan would accomplish this by possessing and using Judas Iscariot, which John brings out in his account back in John chapter 13 and verse 27. John 13:27. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. This was after Jesus dipped the bread the meat or whatever, and handed it to Judas, and Judas ate it. And at that moment, it says, Satan entered him. Then Jesus said to him, now he's talking to Satan because Satan has possession. What you do, do quickly. Now it's the time for you to act. Now, even though Satan was controlling Judas at the time that the mob was led to Jesus, Jesus used the term here, friend, in connection with Judas, not Satan, even though Satan was in possession of his mind, in order to draw attention to a prophecy back in Psalm 41 concerning Judas's connection to the betrayal. Now, this is a prophecy here. Psalm 41 is a prophecy of David. Verse 9, even my own familiar friend. So friend is directly connected to this particular prophecy, in whom I trusted. That is part of the close group, of course we know that to be the 12, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel, or he has turned against me. So that's the prophecy, and the prophecy refers to my own familiar friend. And here, back in John chapter 13, Jesus said, what you do, do quickly, and he says, friend. Friend. In chapter 22 of Luke, verse 49, when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Now, John says that Peter was the one who drew the sword, and that the name of the high priest's servant who lost his right ear, his name was Malchus. Only Luke, the physician, delineates which ear. The other accounts just say cut off an ear. But Luke, being a physician, as we're told, the beloved physician, was very keen on, well, it was the right ear. And generally, doctors are pretty careful about that. Well, from time to time, they were supposed to take off, maybe amputate something on the right leg, and they somehow end up taking off the left. We know that happens, but it doesn't happen too often, so maybe not all physicians were as careful as Luke to know whether it's the right or the left. Now, according to the accounts in Matthew and John, Jesus immediately told Peter to put away his sword, because his arrest, that is the arrest of Jesus, and all of the subsequent treatment had been prophesied for him. So don't try to stop this, Peter. Matthew also recorded Jesus telling Peter that if Jesus, wanted to stop what was taking place, he could ask the Father in heaven for help. And if he did so, he could receive much more assistance than what Peter could provide against such a large mob armed with weapons. Jesus could be rescued by more than 12 legions. That means more than 72,000 angels could come to his assistance if he requested. That's again according to Matthew's account back in Matthew chapter 26. However, for Jesus to do so, to ask for the Father to do this for him, would be contrary to all of the prophecies depicting his arrest and subsequent treatment. Prophecy dictated that the events had to occur the way they did, including the action taken by the Apostle Peter. As indicated back up here in verse 37, Jesus revealed that the reason the disciples needed to bring a sword when they left the upper room was to make possible the fulfillment of the prophecy made back in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12. There's a prophecy there, and it's fulfilled in two different ways. That the Messiah would be numbered among or counted among transgressors or lawbreakers. Using a weapon against any religious or political authority would have been breaking the law. That was not allowed. Jesus wanted to make certain that the disciples would have a weapon at the time that the mob came to arrest him, and have them thinking about that weapon so that they would be inclined to use it in the fulfilling of the prophecy. Because just a few hours earlier, when he said, okay, now I told you before you don't need to take anything, money or whatever, but now I'm telling you, you better take some money, you better take something to take along, extra supplies, and oh, by the way, bring a sword. And they brought a sword. So it's still fairly fresh in their mind. So when Peter attempted to behead the servant of the high priest, Jesus, being the leader of the apostles or the disciples that were there, would be accused either of breaking the law or consorting with lawbreakers, even though he immediately rectified the injury inflicted by Peter, as the next verse 51, goes on to show here. But Jesus answered, verse 51, and said, permit even this. Or the New American Standard has, stop, no more of this. Goodspeed has, let me do this much. And he touched his ear and healed him. Now, the New King James and the New American Standard reflect Jesus telling his disciples to cease any resistance from the mob and allow him to be arrested. The Goodspeed translation exhibits Jesus' intention of making amends for what Peter had done. He simply took the ear, put it back on, immediately it stuck. Not like super glue, like you couldn't see any scar. It was all healed immediately. So let me do this, and so he undid the damage that had been done. Verse 52, then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, or I think is better translated in the complete Jewish Bible, the officers of the temple guard, because that's who that was, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come to him. Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs? By this question, Jesus continued making connection to the prophecy back in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12, about being numbered among the transgressors. Are you treating me like a robber, like a transgressor, like a lawbreaker? Again, emphasizing that particular prophecy. Going on in verse 53, the complete Jewish Bible has, every day I was there with you in the temple court, yet you didn't arrest me. Now, in view of all of the weapons they carried and the presence of Roman soldiers among them, Jesus asked them if they thought he was leading a rebellion. Have you come here because you believe I'm a seditionist? For days he had taught in the temple courts. Now, if he had been teaching sedition, if he had been trying to amass a following to rebel against the Romans, why had they not arrested him then? If I was openly saying these things, then why didn't you get me then? Verse 53 goes on. Now, the New King James says here in the latter part, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. The complete Jewish Bible has, but this is your hour, the hour when darkness rules. Goodspeed translates it totally differently, but you choose this hour and the cover of darkness. Now, even though the Goodspeed translation provides an accurate physical reason why they waited until the nighttime to arrest Jesus, the complete Jewish Bible, the New King James, and many of the other translations bring out how they were manipulated by Satan the devil. This is again, like the King James says, in the New King James, this is the power, this hour is the time of the power of darkness. The appointed time had come for Satan to completely fulfill the prophecy of putting an end to Jesus' physical life. Again, Genesis 3:15. Time had come. So God allowed Satan, he allowed the serpent not only to possess Judas for the betrayal, but also to increase Satan's influence over the men who would arrest, brutally treat, crucify Jesus, and then pierce his body in order to cause him to bleed to death. Satan was given more latitude among those individuals. Satan is the supreme ruler of darkness. The darkness of this age, that's what we're told. The rulers of the darkness of this age, he's supreme. The Apostle Paul talks about the power of darkness and the rulers of darkness back in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. And the power of Satan, according when you put together what Paul brings out back in Acts chapter 26 and Colossians chapter 1, about verses 13, 14, Satan is the power. He oversees. He's the power over the power of darkness. That's his power, the power of darkness. Jesus told the men who had been sent to arrest him that they were acting on behalf of the ruler of darkness. So that's more in keeping with what the intent is here. The good speed, again, brings out a very logical, it is darkness, this is your time, you don't want people to see what you're doing. But it's more to it. It's more to the fact that the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15 is about to take place. Now, according to the accounts in Matthew and Mark, it was at this point when all of the disciples deserted Jesus and fled from the mob. Mark's account also mentions that after the 11 had fled, that there was a certain young man, probably, we all believe that probably was John Mark, who was also following. He was wearing nothing but a very, loose linen cloth or linen cloak. That's all he had on. Now, it was a cold night. We're going to find out as we go on. It was a cold night, but he's not wearing a whole lot for some reason. And so all of a sudden, he's following, and some of the mob grabbed hold of him. They saw him or somehow found him and grabbed hold, but instead of getting John, they got his cloak. And he took off naked, running away. Now, again, Mark is the only one that mentions that because, Mark was probably the one who wrote this, again, on behalf of the Apostle Peter. Anyway, going on in verse 54, then, having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. John's account reveals that they first took Jesus to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. That's back in John chapter 18 in John's account. Annas had been the high priest a few years prior to the time when Caiaphas was installed by the Romans. So Annas had been, now his son-in-law Caiaphas was again in the position of high priest, according to, again, the Romans. This action of taking Jesus there first was either to show respect to Annas or to give the scribes and the elders time to assemble and finalize their plans with Caiaphas prior to Jesus' arrival. They needed some time to talk things over. Annas, when we go to the account in John, Annas briefly questioned Jesus about his disciples and about what he taught. And then when Jesus responded in a certain way, one of the soldiers hit Jesus in the face because you're showing disrespect to the high priest. Well, he wasn't showing disrespect, but this guy was just looking for an opportunity to slap Jesus. And then after that, according to the account in John, Annas sent him on to Caiaphas. Now, since the Sanhedrin could legally meet only during the daytime, this could not have been an official meeting of the Sanhedrin. This late night, early morning meeting was equivalent today to, let's say, a preliminary hearing, where some of the members of the Sanhedrin were attempting, at that early time of the day, to determine whether they could manufacture an irrefutable case against Jesus, because it needs to be iron tight. No way that we can let this slip. Once we've got him in the trap, we've got to follow through. They had only two options. that would yield an immediate death sentence: blasphemy against God or sedition against Rome. Either one would bring the death penalty. They preferred blasphemy because that charge would discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people. If they could not fabricate irrefutable evidence of his guilt, then they would be required to pursue their secondary plan, which was accuse Jesus of sedition against Rome. They had to decide quickly which course of action to take. So they were probably doing some deliberation while Jesus was at Annas's before he was brought there, or during that time and while he was being brought. Verse 54 goes on, "And Peter followed at a distance. Now, when they had kindled a fire in the midst or the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, or around it, Peter sat among them." Now, John's account gives us more details. He reveals that Peter was following the mob with John. So Peter and John were together. They obviously were not with Mark. He was all by himself. But they were still back there somewhere, behind some olive trees and making their way, kind of following the mob. Then, because John was known by the high priest, when they arrived at Caiaphas' house, John was allowed to go into the courtyard. Then, once Peter felt it was safe to do so, he also came to the entrance gate of the courtyard, at which time John tells us that John went out and he spoke to the girl who was responsible for keeping the gate closed and locked to let Peter in. And she did. According to the accounts of Matthew and Mark, it was at this time that the chief priests, elders, and members of the Sanhedrin who were present attempted to find false witnesses to lie about Jesus so that they could have the proof they needed in order to put him to death for blasphemy. Even though they had, it says according to their accounts, there were many false witnesses that came forward. None of their testimonies agreed. So you couldn't find You couldn't find two that agreed, despite the many. They all had something a little different. So when they had failed to find credible witnesses, Caiaphas began verbally attacking Jesus in an attempt to provoke Jesus to say something, to get him angered so that he would say something that could possibly be used against him. When that approach failed, because he could not get a response from Jesus, Caiaphas demanded that Jesus, using the name of God in an oath, declare if he was the Messiah. Because if you are, I want you to make sure that you use God's name, that there's going to be no question about the veracity of what you say. Now, Jesus answered, but he answered without directly using God's name. And he did say that, yes, he was the Messiah. At that moment, when Jesus said that, Caiaphas, feigning mortification at Jesus' answer, how outrageous can this be? He then ripped his clothes and declared that Jesus had committed blasphemy. He then asked the group, after staging this act before them, he asked the group for their verdict. What do you say? And they all responded, yes, he deserves the death penalty. 100% of them. By asking them for a guilty verdict, the high priest knowingly ignored the legal process required in cases involving the death sentence, which was a second judicial meeting on the following day. You could not make a determination to put a man to death unless you had at least 2 trials, 2 days of trial. You needed to have that time. He and those present were already engaged in an illegal activity. at least according to the law, according to their law, which is found back in the Mishnah. It's recorded in the 4th division of the Mishnah that prophesied or that prohibited trials by night and judging capital cases the day prior to a festival, this was the day prior to the sunset. It was going to be the days of unleavened bread, the beginning of the days of unleavened bread. But in the Mishnah, under the 4th section is on Sanhedrin, in section 4, paragraph 1, it says, in capital cases, that is, cases involving the death penalty, they try the case by day and complete it by day. Can't be done at night. Now, of course, they're still in darkness. Dawn hasn't even begun to break at Caiaphas' house. In capital cases, they come to a final decision for acquittal on the same day, but on the following day for conviction. Therefore, they do not judge, again, capital cases, either on the eve of the Sabbath or on the eve of a festival, because the next day is holy time, and that is not allowed to have a meeting to judge those cases. So that's what the Mishnah said. So they were going against the law, their own law. They agreed that Jesus deserved death, but not necessarily the death of a blasphemer. By his admission of being the Messiah, they could now charge him with sedition against Rome and have the Romans put him to death. That's the simplest thing of all. Let them do it. Verse 56, and a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, this man was also with him. Mark's account says that Peter was standing close to the fire to warm himself, and apparently as he turned, he had his back to the fire, and as he turned around toward the fire, those sitting around the fire could clearly see his face. It was the servant girl that let Peter into the courtyard who made this identification. She recognized him. Verse 57, but he denied him, saying, woman, I do not know him. Now, this was the first denial of Jesus. Mark's account states that after this confrontation, Peter left the fire and he went out of the courtyard back toward the entranceway. Maybe he thought that they were going to come after him and he was going to zip on out the gate. We're not told, but for some reason he went away and stood over in that area. It was then at that moment, once he was out of the immediate courtyard, that the rooster crowed the first time. Again, Mark's account is accurate. There was twice the rooster crowed. We covered that last time. Verse 58, and after a little while another saw him and said, you also are of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. Mark's account records that the same servant girl told the others in the courtyard that Peter was one of Jesus' followers. Again, that's in Mark's account. And John's account shows those individuals that she spoke to asking Peter if it was true. Hence, man, I am not. Another saw him and said, all right, this is one that the servant girl had spoken to. Matthew's account states that in the second denial, Peter used an oath. Now, verse 59, Complete Jewish Bible. About an hour later, another man asserted emphatically, there can be no doubt that this fellow was with him, because he too is from the Galilee, or he is too a Galilean, as most translations have. His accent indicated that he was from the Galilee region, which was the area where the hometowns of all of the 12 were located. They were all from Galilee, so they all had that accent. John's account reveals that it was a relative of, guess who? Malchus, who claimed that he had seen Peter in the garden at the time that Jesus was arrested. Now, Malchus was a relative, brother, a cousin? What was he? Well, it doesn't say, but he was a relative. And so you can kind of expect a relative recognizing the guy that tried to decapitate his fellow relative. So he was, there can be no doubt, this fellow was with him. I saw him there. Verse 60, but Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. The accounts of both Matthew and Mark record Peter cursing and swearing in this, his third denial. Mark's account also identifies this as the second time the rooster crowed. Verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Now apparently, at some time during the hour interval between the second and third denials, the illegal primary trial of Jesus had ended, which was taking place inside Caiaphas' house. And so Jesus was led outside so that, the guys could deliberate on the inside while he was out under guard. And even though, he's there in the courtyard, obviously in direct line with Peter, so that Jesus could see him, well, Peter could also see him. Now, the text does not directly state that Peter looked at him, but the inference that follows indicates that their eyes did meet. Verse 61 goes on, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Or as Mark's account accurately says, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Then Peter went out and wept bitterly. So Peter was emotionally crushed over his blatant disloyalty. It hit him like a ton of bricks. Verse 63. Now the men who held Jesus, or had Jesus in custody, mocked him and beat him. And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. This ridicule and humiliation apparently filled the time from the end of the preliminary hearing until daybreak, the time when they were to transport him from the meeting, from Caiaphas' courtyard to the meeting hall of the Sanhedrin. Verse 66, as soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, having already conducted an illegal trial by night and convincing the whole group that had assembled at his home to render a guilty verdict, the high priest now called for an official assembly of the whole Sanhedrin, with Jesus present there among them. It was now daylight time, and it was legal at this point for the Sanhedrin to actually have a meeting. But it was not legal for the members to judge a capital case, since the days of unleavened bread, the first day, would begin that evening at sundown, about 12 hours later. The only way they could accomplish their desire to put Jesus to death at that time without being challenged and charged with illegality would be to force the Romans to do it by charging Jesus with sedition, which is what they had already decided to do at the home of Caiaphas. This was a done deal. They already knew. They just had to get the rest of the Sanhedrin on board. Verse 67 goes on saying, if you are the Christ, or you are the Messiah, as some translations have, tell us. Now, the Sanhedrin is meeting, the whole Sanhedrin. Several hours after the preliminary hearing had ended at the home of the high priest, in the presence of the whole council, Caiaphas, the high priest, repeated the question that had extracted the response from Jesus that had prompted the unanimous call for his death at his home. having earlier concluded that they would coerce the Romans to put Jesus to death for sedition, rather than pursuing a case of blasphemy against Jesus, Caiaphas did not at this time demand, as he did earlier at his home, that Jesus under oath use the name of God in answering the question. Because no need to. We've already decided it's sedition. We don't need to do blasphemy now. So he didn't ask that. Verse 67 goes on, or verse 68 goes on. No, verse 67 goes on. But he said to them, if I tell you, Jesus is answering, if I tell you, you will by no means believe. You're not going to believe my answer. Now, Jesus had indeed told them that he was the Messiah at the preliminary hearing, but he was falsely accused of blasphemy for saying so to the high priest. That's in Matthew's account. Hence the reason he uttered this response in the presence of the whole council. If I tell you, you will by no means believe. Well, why didn't he come out and just say it? He goes on, and if I also ask you, if we were to turn this around and I were to ask you a question, you will by no means answer me or let me go. The last question, and he says this because the last question that he had asked a group of the religious leaders just a little over 2.5 days, sometime late Sunday afternoon, he asked a question. We are now early on Wednesday morning. It's been about 2.5 days, a little over, a few hours over 2.5 days, when he asked them a question that they never answered. They would not respond. That's back in Matthew chapter 22. After Jesus had asked those religious leaders from whom the Messiah was to descend, they all answered, well, that's a no-brainer. David! It's David's descendant. At which Jesus then asked the question, well, if that's the case, why did David call his descendant Lord? Why did he call his descendant his master? And David did that when he was inspired by God to record what in our Bible we have Psalm 110, verse 1, which is, the Lord said to my Lord, the capital L-O-R-D, Yahweh, said to my Lord, David wrote this. The Lord said to David's Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Whoa. Yahweh said to David's Lord, which is his descendant, to sit at his right hand? The religious leaders would not answer that question there in Matthew 22. They would not answer that question Sunday afternoon, and they did not dare ask him for the explanation due to the implications. In fact, what Jesus is saying here, if I ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. If he were to go through many other prophecies, as well as that one, concerning the coming of the Messiah, asking them for explanations, they would refuse to answer each and every one because they would be forced to admit that the prophecies all pointed to him. So, even if I were to ask you, you wouldn't respond. But he goes on then. Hereafter, verse 69, hereafter, in the future, the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. Jesus used the term the power of God as a euphemism for God, so that he would not be accused of blaspheming the name of God. He now refers back to Psalm 110, verse 1, and his question to them that had gone unanswered. He was the Son of Man, and he would shortly, very shortly, be at the right hand, sitting at the right hand of God, exactly where David's Lord and descendant was prophesied to sit, which meant nothing else than he was indeed the Messiah. Then they all said, verse 70, "Are you then the Son of God?" So he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." If Jesus believed that he would sit at the right hand of God, they concluded that he must believe himself to be descended from God. In the preliminary hearing, Caiaphas demanded Jesus to tell the group assembled at his home if he were the Messiah, the Son of God. That's the way he phrased it back in Matthew chapter 26. Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Therefore, the thrust of this question that they ask here is the same that was directly asked earlier that morning. Are you then the Messiah, the Son of God? After he made this statement. And they said, verse 71, what further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. Since they considered the claims that Jesus had made about himself to be utterly outrageous and preposterous, the majority of the council members, not all of them, but the vast majority of the council members had become convinced that Jesus should be put to death. Needs to be done. Now, Matthew's account, Luke doesn't do it, but Matthew's account at this point, I think Matthew's the only one, points, inserts details at this point of what was happening with Judas Iscariot about the time that Jesus was being taken to Pilate's palace. But we're just going to skip that, but that's what takes place as we come to the close of chapter 22. Chapter 23, verse 1. Then the whole multitude of them, or the whole assembly, as some translations have, arose and led him to Pilate. Pontius Pilate had been appointed the Roman governor over Judea in AD 26, basically a little over 3 years, almost 4 years earlier. His primary residence was in Caesarea, but when he came to Jerusalem on special occasions, and of course all of the pilgrimage festivals, when there are many, the population of Jerusalem skyrocketed with all of the pilgrims coming in, he would go to Jerusalem then. He probably stayed in a palace that had been built by Herod the Great near the Jaffa Gate, which was not far from the residence of Caiaphas. According to John's account, in fact, let's go back to chapter 18, John 18, and note this. According to John's account, Pilate at first rebuffed the Jewish religious leaders who brought Jesus to him. Here in verse 28 of John 18, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, or as it's translated in a few places, the palace of the Roman governor. The praetorium, the palace of the Roman governor. And it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover, which would be they would eat it after the sun set that day. Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Kind of sassy, I would think. Then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying what death he would die. The claim made by the Jewish religious leaders here, that it was unlawful for them to put anyone to death, in verse 31, that was in the context of the crime of sedition. Only the Romans had that authority. Only the Romans could put someone to death for rebellion or sedition against Rome. Now, in order to better understand the reason for Pilate's behavior and his reluctance in taking the action that he did as we go on through the story, it would be helpful to review the reasons for this initial sarcastic interaction and continuing disrespect the conduct that was shown by the Jewish religious leaders toward Pilate. Again, as we've covered before, Pilate was a man with this massive ego who in his thinking had been delegated to a position far below his ability and certainly what he deserved. He was chafing under the fact that he thought that he deserved a lot more authority, and as a result, he abused what authority that he did have by making decisions and taking actions that were very unwise. Prior to having Jesus brought before him, he had already been in trouble with the Emperor Tiberius because of some of these failings. The first offense occurred when Pilate caused a major uproar by disregarding the offense that the Jews took to the images of the Caesar that were affixed to the top of the standards that, the soldiers, as the battalions went along, they would have their own assembly group, and so they would walk forward with their standards, and they had these big brass, in this case Tiberius's figure. To the Jews, that was breaking the second commandment, and so as a result, the Roman governors before Pilate acquiesced to the request of the Jews, and they put a cover over the brass or bronze top of their standards so that you couldn't see the face of the emperor. And they did that before they entered the city. Once they went out of Jerusalem, they took them off. But they did that, again, to acquiesce to the Jews' wishes. Pilate, however, believed that the Romans should not comply with the request of these Jews who were subject to Rome. Rome was in charge here. What are you doing listening to the Jews? You don't do what they tell you. We're the ones who are the occupying force. And so he ordered his troops, leave the standards uncovered. Well, the result was a huge riot ensued when the next garrison came marching in, and word got back to Rome, and word got back through the religious leaders. Okay, they made sure they sent somebody as quickly as possible to Rome to go squeal on Pilate. And so word got back that Pilate had not respected the Jewish religion, which had been guaranteed by the first emperor. Julius Caesar guaranteed them freedom of religion. And so Rome had operated on that basis throughout the empire, ever since Julius Caesar, that the Jews could do as they wished. Pilate's next unwise act was to take and use money that had been collected money that had been devoted and collected in the temple treasury in order to build a second aqueduct to bring water that was needed into Jerusalem. Some of the Jews who rebelled at the unholy use of temple money were killed by Roman troops. Once again, word through religious leaders got back to Rome, and Pilate was once again cautioned by Tiberius. 2 strikes, 3 strikes, and you're out. Okay, that's kind of the way it worked. It was for these reasons that in John's account, the Jewish religious leaders were so sarcastic with Pilate when they brought Jesus before him and continued their disrespectful conduct by challenging his desire to release Jesus. Pilate was politically on thin ice, and he knew it. And he knew if he made another major mistake, what authority he did have was going to be taken from him, and he'd be in a whole lot of trouble, and he would be replaced as governor. All right, so that's what's going on in Pilate's mind. And the Jewish religious leaders know that, they've got the emperor's ear. And so they're willing to do whatever it takes. Now, as revealed in John's account, as we've seen here in chapter 18, when asked by Pilate what charges the religious leaders were bringing against Jesus, they only claimed that he's an evildoer. If he were not an evildoer, we wouldn't even bring him here. Evildoer? So when Pilate attempted to dismiss them by telling them to judge him by their law, they responded as follows here in Luke chapter 23 and verse 2. And they began to accuse him, Jesus, saying, "We found this fellow perverting," or misleading, Goodspeed has, misleading the nation, and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. Or as Goodspeed simply translates, claiming to be an anointed king himself. They falsely charged Jesus with sedition against Rome, because he never forbade paying taxes to Caesar, as just a few days earlier was brought out. It wasn't long, it wasn't much before this. Verse 3. So Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him and said, "It is as you say," or Revised English Bible, "the words are yours." Now, John's account, I should have said hold your place there, but back in chapter 18 again, John's account provides more details of this interchange than any of the other accounts of what went on to take place between Pilate and Jesus. It says, "Then Pilate entered," verse 33, entered the praetorium again, called Jesus. So he was out talking. Remember, the religious leaders would not go into the palace. That's Gentile. They would be defiled. They couldn't keep the Passover. So Pilate spoke with them outside. Then he came back in and had Jesus brought to him. Called Jesus and said to him, so he's speaking privately to Jesus. Well, no doubt there's some Roman soldiers around, but none of the religious leaders, no Jews with him. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation. And the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." All right. Now, we then go back to chapter 23 of Luke, verse 4. Then Pilate, he came back out, as John shows us. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and crowd, "I find no fault in," or I find, New Revised Standard, "no basis for an accusation against," Complete Jewish Bible, "I find no ground for a charge against this man." But they were the more fierce, or they persisted, Goodspeed goes on, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." Now, according to John's account, Jesus spoke with Pilate inside his palace. The accounts of Matthew and Mark reveal that when Pilate brought Jesus back outside, that Jesus absolutely refused to refute the charges that were being brought against him by the chief priests and elders. He simply would not speak when he was in their presence. Verse 6, when Pilate heard of Galilee, beginning at Galilee, when he heard of Galilee, he asked him if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Only Luke records this event. By sending Jesus to Herod, Again, that was Herod Antipas. Pilate hoped to rid himself of any further involvement with the belligerent religious leaders whom he knew were anxious to have Jesus executed because of their jealousy. That's brought out back in Matthew and Mark's accounts. He knew from the very start, this is out of jealousy, envy, that they even brought him here. Verse 8, now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, or he was delighted, some translations have, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle. Or the Greek word here is better translated, as some translations like the New Revised Standard has, some sign done by him. So Herod was no different than the scribes and Pharisees who had asked Jesus to perform a sign from heaven. Earlier in chapter 11 they asked, well, give us a sign from heaven. Give us a demonstration of your power. That's all Herod wanted. It wasn't for the good of anybody. It was just to satisfy his desire for some entertainment. Verse 23. Then he, Herod, questioned him, Jesus, with many words, or at some length, the New Revised Standard has. But he answered him nothing. And, or meanwhile, Moffat has, meanwhile, the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. They couldn't keep their mouths shut. You know, Herod's trying to talk to Jesus, get a response, and they're just saying, well, he's belligerent, he won't answer you, he's this, that, and the other. He is, you know, they're going on and all, false accusations. So the situation with Herod was just as it had been with Pilate. Jesus would not speak in the presence of the religious leaders. Not going to say anything. Verse 11, Revised English Bible translates, then Herod and his troops treated him with contempt and ridicule, and sent him back to Pilate, dressed in a gorgeous robe. Herod likely sanctioned this mean-spirited treatment of Jesus because Jesus would neither answer any of his questions nor perform some sign for him. So he was getting very upset with Jesus. It was probably because of being tormented by his part in the death of John the Baptist that Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. He most likely told Pilate that he found no reason for Jesus being put to death because he did not want to be involved in another execution, especially the execution of Jesus, who was not only a worker of miracles, but was also very, very popular in Herod's territory. Verse 12, that very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other. For before that, they had been at enmity with each other, or as the New Revised Standard, they had been enemies. Now, the enmity that existed may have been due to Pilate viewing Herod's rulership, which, again, remember, was granted to him by Rome. Rome gave him his rulership. You know, he didn't deserve it, but he was given that. And Herod viewed what little territory, well, Galilee, Perea, that's not a huge territory. He viewed Herod's rule as being very insignificant, and he treated Herod as an inferior. Now, that doesn't make for good friendship, you know, if one of you is lowly and the other is up here. And, well, you know, those kind of people don't generally get along. And that's what happened here. Now, it's also possible that this rift between the two was created when Pilate killed a group of Galilean Jews. We read about this back in first part of chapter 13, where Pilate had killed a fairly good-sized group of Jews who had brought animals to sacrifice at Jerusalem. Remember, he mingled their blood with the blood of their sacrifices. And so Herod may have been rather upset that he was not consulted about this issue. These are his people, and Pilate treated them this way. What's going on? Now, they became friends, we're told here, because they were both in agreement that Jesus should not be put to death. They were in agreement. They became friends. Verse 13, then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, or the Revised English Bible, on a charge of subversion. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. Goodspeed goes on in verse 15, neither has Herod, for he has sent him back to us. You see, he has done nothing to call for his death. Or Complete Jewish Bible, he has done nothing that merits the death penalty. Pilate stressed that Herod was in complete agreement with him, that Jesus had done nothing to deserve death. Verse 16, I will therefore chastise him and release him. And then parenthetically, Luke goes on to say, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. Pilate offered the religious leaders a compromise here. Okay, I'm willing to compromise on this issue. Though I find no fault, I think he's innocent, I'm going to offer you a compromise. I'm going to officially recognize Jesus as a criminal who is to be punished by being whipped and then released as the year's prisoner that is to be granted the governor's pardon. That was an annual practice in Judea the day the Passover lambs were killed, according to Mark chapter 15, verse 6. That was an ongoing practice. Every year there was a criminal. The crowd could ask for a criminal, and that criminal or the governor would basically choose who to release. Release that individual. All right, I'll punish him, and then I'll release him. Those two things make him a criminal. That should satisfy you. Now, Matthew's account indicates that at about this time, Pilate's wife had sent a message to him, and he received this message from his wife, who told him to leave Jesus alone. This is in Matthew chapter 27, where that's brought out, I think in verse 19 or 20. But anyway, she asked, please leave him alone, because she had had a terrible nightmare that very night. And that nightmare revealed that Jesus was an innocent man. And so this message came to Pilate. He's already knows he's innocent. And now he gets this message, a nightmare, that's a bad omen. Verse 18 of chapter 23 of Luke, and they all cried out at once, saying, away with this man, or as Goodspeed has, kill him, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, or for causing a riot in the city, and for murder. According to the accounts of Mark and John, Pilate asked the crowd if they wanted him to release to them the king of the Jews. You want me to release to you your king, the king of the Jews? However, the chief priests had already used their positions to influence the people to reject Pilate's proposed compromise and ask directly for the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. John's account, in fact, let's turn over to John chapter 19. John's account records that at this point, Pilate followed through with his proposed compromise. He had Jesus whipped with the intention of releasing him after presenting him to the crowd. The Roman soldiers who carried out the beating also ridiculed him after that beating. Note here, John 19, verse 1, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged Note, scourged him. Now the Greek word here for scourged is mastigo. Mastigo. And it's the same word used in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6, where the Apostle Paul, referring back to an Old Testament passage, says that God scourges every son whom he receives. Now, that's not the kind of scourging, obviously, of ripping flesh off of an individual. That's talking basically about whipping. All right? So, mastigo. He took Jesus and mastigo him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. Now that's John. That's what John writes. Hold your place here. Back in Luke 23 again, verse 20, Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus again, called out to them. Pilate had known from the start, again, that Jesus was innocent, but he was now even more motivated to release him after receiving his wife's warning message. So he brought Jesus out of the palace and again claimed that there was no reason for any further punishment. That's back here again in John 19, verse 4. John 19, verse 4, Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man," or "Behold the man, the King of the Jews." That's what he's talking about here. Now, hold your place. Again, Luke 23, verse 21. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The accounts of Matthew and Mark record Pilate giving in to their demand to release Barabbas. Then asking the crowd, so, okay, I'll release him, but then he asked the crowd what they wanted him to do to Jesus. And they did exactly what Caiaphas the high priest wanted them to do. Unanimously, they demanded a Roman execution for Jesus. John's account, again back here in chapter 19, gives additional details of the crowd's reaction when they saw him wearing the robe and the crown of thorns. Note here in verse 6 of John 19. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law. According to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." Wherefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Hold your place. Luke 23 again, verse 22. And he said to them the third time, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him." Or "I've found no reason to sentence him to death," the New Living Translation has. "I will therefore chastise him." Or the New Revised Standard, "I will have him flogged and let him go." John's account presents more information here, picking up in chapter 19, verse 12. This is Pilate's last attempt to push his proposed compromise. From then on, John 19:12, from then on, or the New American Standard has, as a result of this, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a palace, or in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now, it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Again, Luke 23. Verse 23. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. The power of the religious leaders prevailed. They had transformed their pre-selected crowd into a frenzied mob demanding Jesus' execution by a Roman crucifixion. When Pilate realized that he could not calm the situation, he utilized a ceremony that was well known to the Jews to demonstrate, back in Deuteronomy chapter 21, I won't turn there, but in Deuteronomy 21, beginning about verses 6 or 7, there was a ceremony to demonstrate that a man was not guilty of murder. He was to wash his hands and declare his innocence in the presence of others. And so, at this point, according to Matthew 27, Pilate washed his hands in water in front of the entire assembled crowd and proclaimed himself innocent of the blood of Jesus. Verse 24, So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, or demanded, better in the New Living Translation, as they demanded. And he released to them the one they requested, which of course was Barabbas, who for insurrection and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will. We will stop here at this point and pick up the story next time.